I want to say it's an honor to speak to you this morning. I'm going to talk with you today in the time I have about culture, a concept and a topic which I'll acknowledge from the very beginning is ambiguous and difficult to get your hands around because we use culture in so many different ways, and even during the course of my presentation, I'm going to use it in some different ways. But I hope you'll bear with me, and I hope if at any point I'm confusing, you'll stop me and challenge me, question me, and that you'll also work with me around some of the topics that I'm going to introduce, because I plan on addressing the hard issues in education. I always feel that part of my role as a person who is a researcher and who studies schools, but who's also in schools a lot and has been a teacher and a policymaker myself, although we don't often think of local school board members as policymakers. I served as president of the school board in Berkeley, California, and I have the scars to show for it. And that's often where policy is made at the local level, and also do some of that work now at state and national level. So I have a lot of different vantage points, and probably the one that's the most humbling of all is that of a parent. And I always say that the greatest challenge I face is raising my own children. But what I'm going to try to do is to address the issues that I think are most critical and most difficult in education, particularly for you, and based on what I know about you. And I know that this is a mixed group. And I framed this around what I think is a basic and fundamental question. That is, what does it take to educate the children you serve? And I would argue that if you can't answer that question, you shouldn't even be doing this work. But it's not a simple question. Because to answer the question, you actually have to know something about the children you serve. Okay? And I think that so often we make an assumption that we know, and our assumptions inform our actions and our practice, and consequently there's a lot of a disconnect between us as educators and the children we serve because we really don't understand who they are and what their needs are. And so let me start by saying that the best teachers, and I get a chance to visit lots of schools throughout the country, throughout the world, consistently the best teachers don't expect children to learn the way they teach. The best teachers teach the way children learn. If you teach the way children learn, you recognize they don't all learn in the same ways, and you don't blame them when they don't learn. Instead, you start to ask yourself, what do I need to do differently? What's not happening here for this child? Because learning should come naturally for children. And when it doesn't, then we have to ask ourselves, what's wrong with the environment? What's wrong with the way we've approached it that has prevented it from occurring? Too often when it's not happening, when the children are not learning, we say, well, what's wrong with those kids? What's wrong with that child? What's wrong with their parents? And that tendency, I would argue, is one of the major obstacles to greater success in education today. The tendency to blame kids, and by extension, their parents. I worked with a colleague, Ron Heifetz, at Harvard when I taught there. Ron is in the Kennedy School of Government with the Center for Public Leadership. He and I were asked to design a program to train superintendents around the country. Most of Ron's work was with elected officials and business leaders. But I was familiar with his work, and I said, there are two concepts that you use in your work. I'm specifically referring to his book, Leadership on the Line, that I think are directly relevant to the work we do in education. And that's the distinction he draws between what he calls technical work and adaptive work. Okay. And I want you to think about it because even if you're not a superintendent or a principal, I think it's also relevant to teachers. Technical work is the business of being in compliance with rules and procedures. If you are focused on assessment, it's making sure that you assess those kids according to the law, that you cover the standards. It's making sure that if you're in leadership role, that there's heat in the building, the kids are fed, you have certified people in your classroom, if that's what the law requires. Because running a school is running a complex organization. People need to be paid. Okay? That's the technical work. It's essential work, because without it, these complex organizations don't function. But none of that work is about whether or not kids are actually engaged in learning, whether or not they're excited about being there, whether or not they're stimulated, whether or not they're motivated, whether or not they understand the larger purpose of education, or whether or not you know how to reach them. My colleague Debbie Meyer, who founded a school in central Harlem called Central Park East, and though she's 83 years old, continues to be very active in the field. I asked her to come to visit my students and speak to my students one day, and one of the students asked her a question, what's the purpose of education? And she very quickly said there's always been only one purpose to education in all countries at all times. And that is to prepare young people to become responsible adults. If they get high test scores, but they get strung out on drugs, we failed. If they get into the best colleges, but they rob banks, we failed. Education, when successful, should teach people how to live, how to make responsible decisions, which means it's not simply about how well they do academically by conventional measures, because the social and the emotional aspects of learning are also so essential. My father was a cop in New York City for 27 years, like to say, common sense really isn't that common. How do you educate people for common sense, for social and emotional intelligence, all of which are really important for being prepared for the world we live in? The adaptive work that Heifetz talks about means that we recognize that we're doing this work in a complex environment, that the work itself requires that we constantly reflect on what we're doing and ask ourselves questions about whether or not we're meeting the needs of the children we work with, because preparing them for the world out there is not a simple task. You don't achieve that simply by being in compliance. Finding the right balance between the technical and adaptive work is, I would argue, the essential part of doing this work well. You've got to do the technical work or you get in trouble. But if you don't do the adaptive work, you end up with kids who are bored, who are disengaged. You end up with classrooms that are out of control. You end up with teachers who are demoralized. You end up with schools that don't function because they don't understand how to meet the needs of the children they serve. It's like the distinction between a family. Most people get married not because they want to run a household together and pay bills. Anybody who's had a family knows if you don't pay the bills and run that household and keep everybody fed knows that it doesn't work. That's an essential part of being a family. But if you're not conscious of the relationships within that family, if you don't talk to each other, family falls apart. Same thing is true with schools. Relationships are at the core of building successful schools. And all the research shows that the relationships between the children and the adults, between the adults who work there and the parents they serve, are the critical variables influencing the character of a school. And when there are strains in those relationships, there's breakdown, and there's often dysfunction in the school. And that dysfunction gets manifest in lots of ways. Gets manifest in high turnover on the staff. Gets manifest in problematic behavior amongst the kids. Gets manifest in conflict and tension within the building. My colleague, Charles Payne, teacher at the University of Chicago, just wrote a book called So Much Reform, Why So Little Change? He asked the question, why is it that after 30 years of trying to reform schools in Chicago, he focused on Chicago, schools aren't getting better? And he says, when you go look into the schools that are consistently not performing, what you consistently find is a dysfunctional culture. And I'll argue right now that if you change the curriculum, you change the organization, you bring in a new professional development, bring in new textbooks, but don't change the culture, nothing will change. I'll come back in a moment about what I mean by culture in this sense. But that work is the adaptive work. creating a culture that allows people to do their best work, that allows us to build these relationships, powerful relationships with children, that's the adaptive challenge of the work. It's harder to prepare you for that work. My colleague Jerry Murphy from the Ed School at Harvard, who was formerly the dean, he's talking about preparing principals and how hard it is to prepare principals. He said, well, a principal is a lot like a sea captain. So you can give them technical training, but how do you prepare them when they're out at sea? And they have to figure out whether or not they should come in or go further out because they have to be able to read the seas. How do you prepare them to have good discretion? How do you prepare them to be wise? And I would say that principals need to be wise and have good discretion. Teachers need to be wise and have good discretion. Because so many of the decisions you make, you can't rely on a handbook to figure out the best way to resolve a particular problem or challenge you're faced with. That's the adaptive work that I want to talk to you about today. As I said already, the big question, and there are lots of questions related to the adaptive work, but the one I want to focus on today is what does it take to educate the children you serve? Because I think it's the most basic and fundamental. And as I pointed out already, built in, embedded into that question are several sub-questions. I've only enumerated a few of them, such as what are their needs? Academic, social, and emotional. They're connected, aren't they? Kids who come to you who are neglected at home, abused, who have parents that are unattentive or inattentive, will have often more trouble in the classroom. Can't separate the intellectual from the emotional and the social. Not in the same person. What are their strengths and interests? One of the things we've learned about from the research on resilience is you produce resilient children, and particularly poor children, not just poor children, but children who've faced with obstacles need to become resilient. They need to learn how to persevere because life is harder for them. Their resilience is the byproduct of confidence and competence. We acquire competence by building on the strengths in our children. So often I go to schools and all I can hear the educators talk about is the deficits in children. What's wrong with them, what they don't have, what they can't do, which prevents them from seeing the strengths and all they bring. I meet kids who have memorized the lyrics to hundreds of songs, but can't seem to memorize anything in the classroom. Not because they don't have the ability to remember, but because we haven't found a way to make what we want them to retain meaningful enough that they will decide, let's hold on to this too. Knowing about their interests, about their needs, is a big part of figuring out how to educate them. Knowing about the challenges they face outside of school, what's going on in their lives, what's happening with their families. Knowing about their parents' hopes and dreams. Knowing about how they learn when they're not with you. Because we don't teach kids with empty heads. They come in with knowledge, skills, and experiences that they use to acquire new information. All of that, I would argue, and there's much, much more I could add to that list, is an essential part of figuring out what does it take to educate the children you serve. But if you see this largely as a technical enterprise, right, that is, you've been trained, you've been provided a curriculum, and now you're going to be dispatched to go teach those kids, and it almost doesn't matter who they put in front of you, now you're ready, well, guess what? Chances are you're going to probably experience a lot of trouble. I have a colleague, he's the head of surgery at the University of Toronto Medical School, a Jamaican, trained at the University of West Indies. And I saw him, I said, you know, it's amazing to me that a Jamaican comes to Toronto and rises to the top position at this very prestigious hospital in Canada. How did that happen? He said, everybody wants to know that. You know? because all of my colleagues have degrees from all these distinguished universities. He said, but you know what happened when I got here? They quickly realized I had skills they didn't have. You know what those were? I knew how to talk to people. Patients would come in, they had some condition that was not easily diagnosed. I would talk to them, I'd ask them questions about their background, and I would learn about them, and lo and behold, I became the best person in this hospital, widely recognized at diagnosing illness. And I learned that because I worked in conditions where I didn't have all the techniques, I didn't have all the latest equipment, so I had to just figure out how to talk to people to learn about their condition. And when I came here, they recognized that was an invaluable skill. So I rose to leadership in the school, in the hospital. A lot of these soft skills about how to relate to children, how to establish rapport with children, you can't teach them so easily. But they're so critical to whether or not you're going to succeed in the classroom. Herb Cole wrote a book, 1974, called I Won't Learn From You. Not that I won't learn. Just from you, I won't learn. How many of you have seen kids who in one classroom, they're on task, they perform, they're engaged, another classroom is not happening? How many of you have seen that happen? Okay, we've all seen it, right? And almost always what distinguishes the performance in one classroom from the other classroom is what? It's the relationship that teacher has managed to establish with the student. Because students learn through relationships. So this question and this work, this adaptive work, I would argue is right at the core of your work as educators. And whether or not you can do it, whether or not you can get better at it over time, because it's not the kind of thing where you say, I took that course, I'm ready, I got the adaptive challenges figured out. No, because they're going to keep chumming. Think about this. The nature of childhood has changed in America, hasn't it? Probably changed in other places too, but I know for sure it's changed in this country. How are children different today than they were 20 years ago? Anybody? What are some of the differences you see? Yes?
A lot more technology.
They know a lot more about technology. If you have trouble with any computers, ask a little kid, right? They could help you, right? What else? Say again?
Multitasking.
They're multitasking, right? They're able to do lots of juggling lots of things at once. They're overscheduled often, particularly middle-class kids. Shorter attention span, very often. A lot of kids don't play, right? They can't go outside to play. When I was a kid, we used to go out to play. In the wintertime, we'd be out playing. Come home, our hands numb. We'd play for hours. I have to make my kids play. I said, stop playing video games. Go outside and play. Go play. I said, play? There's no one. Play. I had to introduce them to the kids on the street. I said, these kids, meet these kids. Now they're best friends. But that's different now. What's the number one health challenge for children today in America? Obesity. In part because they're not as active as they were, unless they're scheduled. Right? And inner city kids tend to be less scheduled. Right? There's good research that children are literally entering puberty earlier today than ever before, and staying in adolescence longer than ever before. Well into their 40s, people are still trying to figure out, who am I? What am I about? Right? If the nature of childhood has changed, if the way children are learning today has changed, then the way we continue to teach them also has to change. It has to stay relevant to who they are. Right? Which means we've got to see this work as dynamic, we've got to constantly reflect on the practice and ask ourselves whether or not we are succeeding at educating the children we serve. So with that in mind, I want you to now think about the children you serve and what the kind of assumptions we make about culture. Okay, and I'm going to use culture now in a different way. Culture relates to your background, whether that has to do with ethnicity or national origin or race. And I want to start by recognizing, I'm going to use a definition of culture that comes out of anthropology, which is really that it's a system of ideas that enable us to make meaning of phenomena in the social world. Okay. Because it's that system of meaning that gives meaning to our clothing, that gives meaning to our speech, that gives meaning to our dress, our taste. You only know when you're in a different culture, usually or what your culture is when you're in a different culture, right? Or when you're encountering and interacting with someone who's different, because there's no shared understanding. Right? That's why a lot of times we think the other person has the accent. What a strange accent, because we think we speak normal. They speak with the accent. Right? At the same time, all of us occupy numerous cultures simultaneously. Right? The culture of work, the culture of the family, the culture of your sexual orientation, the culture of your religion. All of us are occupying numerous cultures. And for many of us, this is not a problem. We navigate these almost seamlessly. But for some of us, it may be more of a difficulty. Because when the cultures are more different, the strains and the stresses of transferring from one cultural setting to another can induce stress in a person. So for example, if you come from a home that's very religious, when you go to school where there are different norms in place, then there can be tensions because what's expected at home and what's expected in school is so far apart. So the greater the degree of cultural difference, often the greater the degree of stress and strain on the person. Okay, and helping people to navigate these strains and stresses is very important because, again, we often are not even aware of what they're going through because we see things from our cultural frame of reference. Can't help but doing that. The last thing we know, well, on this slide, is that we learn through shared cultural understandings. Vygotsky, the Russian linguist, talks about learning through the zone of proximal development. That is that part of learning, the reason it's easier to learn something if we can connect it to something that's already familiar. So one of the reasons why learning a language like Arabic or Chinese, Cantonese is so difficult if you speak a Romance language because the letters are different. It's the whole ways in which they use language is so different from something that's familiar to us. Not that it can't be learned, it's just more challenging. Okay. And it's also true that teaching is a cultural transaction. And that part of what makes the transaction work is the degree to which we know how to take ideas and concepts and skills and make them relevant and meaningful to the person at the other end. Right, so you ever have to stop and ask for directions in a strange place? You always got to be careful about who you ask, right? Because you don't want to waste your time, right? And you know, some people are just friendly, and they'll give you directions even if they don't know what they're talking about, right? They'll give you directions. And there are some people, they could talk and talk, and you will never understand what the hell they talked about because it doesn't make any sense to you. Because their ability to convey that knowledge to you is just too limited, or your ability to receive it is too limited. Well, there's some kids who are in classrooms where they just can't figure out what you're saying. Because the degree of alignment, the degree to which we're able to communicate in ways that are meaningful to them are limited. But I just want to acknowledge that this is an important part of teaching because it's really the medium through which we learn. When there are cultural mismatches, when there's a difference in culture between the person who's teaching and the people who are learning, there are often tensions. Often tensions. To a large degree because we tend to view differences in culture as a sign of deficiency. If you're not like me, then you're not quite as good. Not always. Some of us learn to respect differences, but a lot of us, if you don't do it like me, not as good. Okay? And that judgment, that tendency to judge, is a fairly common human tendency. Okay? But it has serious and often severe implications for teaching when we are teaching children who are from a different background than us. And I'm not to say, I'm not a cultural relativist. I know that we all have differences, right, in how we do things. And we might decide, well, some differences, I think this way is better, actually, okay? And I think that's a whole other topic we could debate about whether or not there are certain cultural practices and traditions that are problematic and really should be changed. That's another topic. But I just want to acknowledge here that when there's a difference, it often affects our ability to teach and to communicate. because we don't know how, and our judgments and our tendency to make judgments based on those differences often kicks in. We also know that those differences, when they're there, often become manifest in communication problems and behavior problems. And almost always, when I find a classroom that's out of control, where kids are acting out, what I almost always look to is, how does that teacher communicate with the children? Not to say that I'm blaming the adult, because there are challenging children out there, right, who have special needs and who present, particular challenges to us. But when you find consistently that this adult has trouble with a population of kids, it's often because they simply don't know how to relate to those kids. I'll give you one short story to illustrate the point. Working with a school in Oakland, California. They have a brand new teacher from Teach for America. How many Teach for America graduates there? Okay, a couple. All right, good to see you. So you know the profile. They're young, they went to a good college, they're idealistic, they're very briefly trained, and then they're sent into very difficult schools. So she's working in a school in Oakland, and she comes up to me one day and she says, I'm having trouble with classroom management. She said, no one's been willing to help me. Could you give me some pointers, come observe me? And I said, sure, I'd be happy to come into your classroom. So I sit in the classroom. After a few minutes, it's clear it's far worse than she described. Total chaos in the room. Kids are screaming, there's yelling. At the end of the period, she turns to me, she said, well, you see what I'm talking about? I said, yeah, this is bad. She says, well, I can't take it anymore. I'm about to quit. I'm going home with migraines every day. So let's go to see the principal. See if the principal can help. So together we go see the principal, and she explains what's happening in the classroom. The principal listens. At the end of a conversation, she says, you're a professional, deal with it. Then I speak up, and I say, listen, if you don't help her, she's going to quit. It's March. If she quits now, you'll have to get a sub for the rest of the year. So that alarms her, no, I don't want that. He said, I have an idea. We have a veteran teacher who's just retired from the school. She's great with kids, and she's available as a substitute now. I'm going to ask her to come back to take over your classroom for a few days. I can only afford a few days, but I think you might pick up some things from watching her. So both the new teacher and I think, well, it's the best idea we've heard, only idea that seems to make any sense, let's try it. So the next day, the veteran teacher shows up. And there's something about the walk, something about the look she gives, but the kids can tell almost instantly the real thing is here today. So the classroom was previously out of control is suddenly on task. Kids are working, normal classroom, they're engaged. Math class, she's there teaching. New teacher and I are shocked. They can't believe this has happened so quickly. At one point during the lesson, though, she sees two girls talking. So she stops what she's doing. She says, young lady, when I'm speaking, I want you to be quiet. She goes to write on the board, and under her breath, the girl says, bitch. But not a direct bitch. Indirect. Did they use that word in Sweden? You know that word. So the veteran teacher stops what she's doing. She says, young lady, do I look like your mother? And the girl reacts like that. She's like, no, you don't look like my mother. And she says, whenever you speak to me, I want you to think of your mother. And she goes back to the lesson. Girl goes back to work. Class does not miss a beat. New teacher turns to me and says, how did she know that that would work? My question to you is, what does the veteran teacher know that the new teacher doesn't? But she didn't know those students. They weren't her students. She knew something about the culture, that environment. She worked in that school, that community. Do you think she might have got that technique in grad school? She pulled that out and said, I remember when they call you. What does she know about these kids that the new teacher doesn't? Culture. But she also knew these kids know better. She knew that if she simply was comfortable with her own authority and reminded this girl, that's not happening here, the girl actually would go along and work with her. Okay? New teacher thought she was teaching wild children. They needed Valium or some kind of drug to calm them down. The veteran teacher didn't cite the rules. There must be a rule against bitch calling. Why not cite the rule? Why doesn't she cite the rule? The kids know the rule? Is there any school in America where you could, or in Sweden for that matter, where you can curse at teachers? No. But the children will push, they will test, they will challenge, because this was really a test. They want to know, how is she going to respond? She doesn't call the dean. Why doesn't she call the dean? Why doesn't she get some backup here? I need a backup. They called me a bitch in here. I need somebody to help me now. Why not get some help here? Huh? It's disempowering to the teacher. If one little bitch sent you for help, you really are, you're lost here, aren't you? If that's all it took to get you to scamper off. Part of what I'm saying, and some people have spoken to this already, is that for teaching, I always say teaching is a lot like the martial arts, okay? If you think about the martial arts, you don't get to be a master, you don't get to be a black belt just because of seniority. Right? So I've been at this for 20 years, I should be a black belt by now. No, you can be a white belt after 20 years. You actually have to master techniques. Right? Some people become a black belt in 6 years. Right? Because they take time to master the craft. And teaching is both art and skill. You can learn the skills. The art comes from character, experience, personality, comes from what you've learned along the way through trial and error, comes from your ability to read the situation. Maybe some kids, if she had used that same technique, it could have gone differently. Right? So there's no one way to handle the situation. But I give you the example because to me what it reflects is that we have people who've acquired a certain understanding about how to work with children that are often in our schools that we often don't recognize. Some of those people might be classroom aide, librarian or the custodian. They don't know how to talk to kids because they have this ambiguous quality about them we call moral authority. Right? Moral authority is not rooted in your title, it's rooted in the relationship. If you don't have adults with moral authority in the school, you have a school that's usually out of control. Because the kids will respect adults that they know carry themselves in a way that suggests I'm to be respected, that build those relationships that are so essential to learning, that are comfortable with their own sense of authority in relation to children. They are not authoritarian, but at the same time not afraid to recognize they're adults in the classroom, therefore have to be responsible for setting and creating a climate where children can learn. Children actually feel comforted to know that there's an adult here who is comfortable with their own authority. They feel, wow, relaxing. I'm so glad we got a real adult today. A lot of that is about the culture we create in our classrooms, and not so much about the cultural background of children. Okay? You can have a diverse classroom of all kinds of kids and create a classroom where children learn the norms of that room, what's expected of them, and learn to trust and feel confidence in that teacher. Because the good news is this: the children are less prejudiced than the adults. The children are less prejudiced than the adults. The adults have more hang-ups than the kids. When you ask the kids, who are the teachers you respect, who are the teachers you learn from, they will almost never talk about race or culture or language. They'll talk about the character and the qualities of the person. The adults are hung up on race and culture and all these other issues. They have much more trouble with this. The kids see right through you. They know if you have biases. They know if you like certain people over other people. They know if you wore the same shirt 2 days in a row, don't they? Or if you got a bad haircut. They're watching you. They're watching you. There's so much responsibility, moral and ethical responsibility we invest in teachers that we don't really treat them, train them, and prepare them for. I was talking that with Gita last night about the fact that in this country we've started to confuse secularism or interpret to mean amoralism. Right? That there's no ethical or moral foundation to education, and that results in schools where the adults lose total authority because they no longer even teach kids basic right or wrong. Right? They rely on the rules. Right? Lawrence Kohlberg, former colleague, used to teach about moral development in children and remind us that teaching kids to do what's right to avoid punishment is a very low level of moral development. What we should be after is teaching kids to do what's right, even when we're not looking. Even when we're not looking, because they've developed their own internal sense of ethics, they can make good decisions on their own. That takes much more work, doesn't it, than relying on a set of rules and procedures. And that work is so essential to creating a classroom where children can learn and a school where they can perform. The last thing I have up there is also part of the problem, which is that we, particularly in this country, but I imagine it's not just true in this country, I imagine it's true in many countries, have often made assimilation a prerequisite for success. If you don't assimilate into the dominant culture, then your ability to be successful is going to be more limited. And one of the ongoing debates in education and race in this country is this idea that black children interpret being successful with acting white. And I often say, well, you know what? In many schools, if you don't act white, you're not going to be successful. If you don't learn to speak the way white children might speak, standard English, say, the way middle-class children speak, if you don't learn to carry yourselves in a certain way, then you will be penalized. Right? You will find that certain opportunities are not there for you. And anybody who is from a different background gets it. They understand, yeah. Part of being in the minority means you have to learn to function like those in the majority. Because if you don't, you find opportunities denied. Okay. Well, for some children, that transaction, understanding that I've got to give up my identity to be successful, means that it gets interpreted as I've got to then lose connection to my community, my family, the people I'm a part of. And they will also choose not to. And while I understand, I'll come back to this in a moment, that part of what education should do for kids is give them the ability to have skills and to cross borders so they can become more powerful. So having more than one language is a good thing. Having the ability to function in multiple environments is a good thing, and education should do that for you. We call that code switching. If you're an educated person, you should be able to function in multiple environments and not feel inadequate. But the question is, how do we teach kids to do that? And I would argue, again, it comes back to relationships. If when we're correcting their speech and correcting their behavior, they don't know that the person who's doing it is because they care about me, the person doing it is not putting me down, the person doing it is doing it because they want to make me more capable, stronger, better able to function, then often they will do the opposite of what you've asked them to. Right? So they're sagging, their pants is coming down, you can see the whole bottom. Right? You say, pull up those pants. They think you're doing it to put them down, what do? They show you the whole thing now, right? They're going to give you the whole bottom to see. Right? Because, again, it's about the relationship. So I want you to think about that, again, in the context of working with children from different backgrounds, different ethnic groups, and why it's problematic. The other reason why it's problematic, of course, is because stereotypes are so powerful. We rely on stereotypes a lot to make judgments about people. And what we know about stereotypes is that they not only affect the way we see others, but they also affect those who are seen through the lens of the stereotype. They can be very limiting. Claude Steele's written a lot about stereotype threats and the ways that can impact your performance, because we all know the script. How many of you have heard that Asian kids are just naturally talented at math? How many it's in their culture. How many have heard that? Right? Even in Sweden, they have that one too. It's in the culture. Right? Or that black people are just good at dancing. It's in their culture. How many are good at basketball? Hardest thing to be is a tall black man who can't play basketball. Right? It's in the culture. Well, how many of you know tall black men that can't play any basketball, can't dance? And guess what? There's some Asian kids who are not good at math. But we rely on these stereotypes. I've pointed out to people there's a school in San Francisco, Galileo High School. 90% of the kids are Chinese. 50% of them drop out before graduation. They don't drop out because they're not sufficiently Chinese. There's more to their performance than their culture. Okay? And because we often are using culture in ways to make these broad generalizations about people and groups, we often ignore individual differences and the other factors that go and contribute to academic success, such as the kind of school you go to. Children from different backgrounds do need to learn to become bicultural, right? Need to learn sometimes to be multicultural, to function in multiple settings, and relationships will determine if they can do that. Okay. They also need to go to schools where it's possible to go beyond stereotypes. Right? Teresa Perry, Asa Heard, Claude Steele wrote a book called Young, Gifted, and Black, analyzing the schools and the conditions that produce high achievement amongst African American students. Because in this country, low achievement is the norm in so many places. And what they consistently find is when you look at those schools, what they have in place, often it's implicit, but sometimes it's explicit as well, is a counter-narrative that's telling these kids that while the rest of the society might tell you you're not smart, the rest of the society might tell you you're better off playing sports than doing math and science, in this school, it's a different message you're getting about what it means to be black, or what it means to be academically and intellectually successful. And they argue that you need that powerful message because the effects of the environment are so powerful, so overwhelming that if you don't have it, kids will succumb to the stereotypes. Because those stereotypes are powerful. And so part of what we've got to do is to figure out what does it take to create schools where kids can break out of stereotypes. I work with a school like that now, Excellence Charter School in Bed-Stuy in Brooklyn. Their fourth graders are some of the highest performing fourth graders in the state of New York. All African American, all male. How do they do it? Well, they have a deliberate strategy of consciously telling these kids that they can be successful. All students are referred to as scholars. It seems a little arbitrary, but they want the message to them very early on, you're a scholar. And they also deliberately expose those kids to activities that they know are outside of their experience, like chess and robotics, because they know that part of breaking stereotypes is exposing them to new experiences. Education should do that. John Ogbu, who's had a lot of influence on the way at least Americans, and even beyond this country, think about cultural differences and race and performance, has, I think, made important contributions, but contributions that in some ways have limited our thinking about these issues. He uses two broad categories to talk about groups between dominant, particularly groups that are subordinate in this country. It makes a distinction between voluntary minorities, immigrants who came here voluntarily, so most Asian immigrants, for example, who he argues willingly accept cultural assimilation as the price of being a new country. And then he compares them to groups like African Americans and Puerto Ricans and Native Americans and Inuits, who equate cultural assimilation with cultural domination and are more likely to be oppositional in the way they engage in school. And this view, Ogbu's theories, had a lot of influence on the way people think about why it is that certain kids are not performing in school. And I just put it up there because I gave you a reading. I'm not sure if you all got that. He does a lot of international comparisons because he points out that this is true not just in the United States, it's true in other countries. If you're a member of the subordinate group, where there's a history of looking at that group as inferior, it tends to have implications for how well that group does in schools.
We are talking about the Ross philosophy, the RGA philosophy,
Right.
which is based on transforming the way education is for the future. That's why I would like to ask you, are we going to be able to interject in saying that I would like to see the dominant group children also being bicultural or tricultural in order to be able to form the society we want to hope to, where everybody is being recognized as successful.
I think that's great. And I think that's what makes the Ross curriculum, the Ross approach so important, right? Because that goal, I think, is one that we should all strive for. But what I do want to point out, though, that the burden on the subordinate group, the burden on the minority is different than the burden on the dominant group.
Definitely, yes.
Because
but
if
that burden can be carried if we teach children. The children from the dominant group also should feel responsible to carry that burden together.
I agree, but I want to keep in mind the real world that we live in.
Yes.
Okay, if you are, for example, a young African American or Latino boy,
Yes.
one of the things you have to learn very early is how to make people not be afraid of you.
Yes.
Okay, because and you don't realize you're just a little 12-year-old, just like any other boy, lots of energy. But you don't realize that maybe it's at a subliminal level or some other level that your very presence, your tone of voice scares the hell out of some people. And if you don't learn how to smile, if you don't learn how to read them and understand when they're afraid, you will find that you will be shunned, you will be punished, you will not know how to engage a police officer. Right? You could be in big trouble. So yes, children in the majority also benefit from learning how to be multi and bicultural and to function in multiple settings. But the consequence of not doing it is not as severe often. But I agree with you, and I think that we should all strive. And I think that what I really like about what you're saying is that if we see this as value added, right? Mm-hmm. Right? That is that not as taking away their culture, but adding to it.
Yes.
Right? So that now these kids become bilingual, multilingual, yes. Multicultural, then it's adding to their strength rather than taking something away from them.
Yes. I had a very painful experience in teaching French immersion in a program in North Carolina, Northeast region, where the majority actually is not white, it's black community. And the children refused to learn French from me because they told me exactly they don't want to act white. And myself not being white, I told them, I said, well, and then they thought I should teach them Japanese, but I'm not Japanese. So in a sense, if it helped by the mere fact of my existence to break the stereotype, and the kids become very, very successful.
Often we don't understand what the children are going through when they have to make these changes, right? And why it may be difficult for them, why they may sometimes resist even what we're trying to teach them, why they may want to hold on to that non-standard English that their grandmother speaks to them. Okay? And I think that if we can have a kind of open conversation with them about this, Lisa Delpit calls learning the codes of power. Right? And what's important about that is to recognize that power in this country, what's the powerful language in Sweden? If you want to have power? Swedish. It's not English. No, it's Swedish. Okay. In India, it's English. Okay. Understanding what it takes to have access to opportunity is an important part of demystifying power and the way it works. Okay. It's also about explaining to kids that life is sometimes not fair. And people will judge you based upon your look. And the reason why we want you to pull up your pants is we don't want them to make assumptions about you because your pants are hanging down. And when you wear that hood on your head, you might just think it's nice style, but guess what? Some people think you're in a gang now. And that's not fair, but that's what's happening. And if we can be open with our kids and explain this is what's going on out there sometimes, and they believe that we really care about them, and that part is so essential, then maybe they're going to be more open to learning it. So this is, and the thing is, this is not on the state framework, right? Teaching the kids these things. It's not kind of part of the curriculum, maybe, but it's so essential to preparing them for life in the world they live in. There's a lot of problems with Agbu's approach. One is the fact that he treats culture as static, doesn't acknowledge that it's constantly changing, evolving. Within groups, there's lots of differences. That not all immigrant groups in this country, even those we might call voluntary, are successful, because you got to look at the class background of kids. You got to look at the education level of their parents. All that affects their performance, right? Schools they attend. You got to look at deviations, sometimes within the same family. You see deviations in performance. Right? Some kids are one sibling doing way better than another sibling, so these generalizations sometimes prevent us from recognizing and understanding the differences. Cultures are rooted in norms, in values, in practices, in rituals that reinforce the core values we believe in. Okay. Cultures in a school setting send the message about what's important. Okay? And I want to say this now, particularly to the folks at the school in New York, because you're still a new school. That how you create a culture is going to be such an essential part of whether or not you'll succeed with the children. And that means how you work together, how you work with those children, to the degree to which you can all be on the same page in reinforcing common themes. This school has been around a lot longer, and I know you've already developed practices that reinforce core values here. I'm not so sure about the lower school or Tiensta in your success at doing that. Okay? Because it's harder to do when you're new and you're evolving. But I would argue that this cultural work is so essential to whether or not you're going to succeed with your children. Okay. Seymour Saracen, Yale psychologist, argued that if you don't change the culture of a school, nothing changes. And it's helpful to at least understand what are the signs when there's an unhealthy culture. When you hear them blaming the kids, blaming the parents, when staff takes no responsibility for the learning, because they see teaching and learning is disconnected, all that's a sign of a sick and unhealthy culture. The best schools take responsibility without blame. They don't say, I wish we had some new kids so we could be a better school. If we just had some new kids here, we would really we would get better. No, they keep asking themselves, what could we do differently to meet the kids? The best schools have a staff that's willing to share and recognizes that staff morale, how you feel about your work, is such a critical part of all this. Because the best schools are always places where people work harder, and they don't work harder because someone makes them work hard. They work hard because they want to. Because the environment, they're part of something collectively that's important, that they feel that collective spirit. The research is very inconclusive about whether or not it helps influencing achievement. Right? That is, that if you have someone of a similar background teaching a child, does that result in higher gains? There's no evidence that that's true. That's good news. Otherwise, we'd be in big trouble, right? But what the research does show is that when there's diversity within the staff, the ability of that staff to problem solve, the ability of that staff to work together to figure out how to meet the needs of the children usually goes up. So diversity is often seen as an added value, but not necessarily showing up in terms of actual student achievement at a one-to-one level, but more at an aggregate level. Creating of the common culture means that we've got to work through our differences as adults to come to some agreements about how we're going to do things. If I can eat in your classroom, but I can't eat in your classroom, what do I think about her? Right? Not so good, right? Right? That is, inconsistency in how we do things undermines the children, actually. Right? Just like when the parents aren't on the same page, then usually the children suffer, right? And I would add here, it's not just about what the teachers are doing, it's about what the custodian does, it's about what the receptionist does. Everyone in the school has to understand we're part of this together. Common mission. And if it's a powerful culture, it not only influences the adults, it also influences the students and the parents as well. Because they understand that they're part of a common endeavor of educating children. Okay? So, but I'll again acknowledge, doing this, achieving the buy-in that it takes to create this kind of powerful culture is very, very hard. Because you can't impose culture on people. You can't say, from now on, we will treat each other with respect. If you don't, you're fired, right? That's a culture of coercion and intimidation. It's got to come more organically. It's got to be more bottom-up. We've got to actually want to do this. Right? And that's why it's hard. Because people, everybody, especially Americans, are so individualistic. We're so idiosyncratic. And in our classrooms, we often have the sense to think our classroom's our kingdom. Right? my classroom. I do it my way here. And that gets in the way of creating a common culture in a school, where the adults are all working together for common objectives. But when you can achieve that level of agreement, that level of buy-in, it gets a lot easier for the kids, because there's so much more consistency there. I would also add, and the signs of a dysfunctional culture, if you're having trouble with parents, there's a lot of conflict with your parents, signs something's wrong, that they're not part of this yet, and you need strategies for how you're going. A lot of teachers don't even know how to conduct a parent-teacher conference. Don't know how to conduct that conference. That parent comes away with meaningful information so they feel more able to support their child. Shouldn't that be the goal of a parent-teacher conference? And all the research shows that when parents are reinforcing education at home, children benefit. So how do we build a partnership based upon mutual respect, where it's very clear to the parents that we care about their kids? My colleague Bill Ayers, when he was a kindergarten teacher, used to start the parent-teacher conference like this. He says, "You know more about your child than I do. What can you teach me about your child to make me a better teacher?" Think about that as a parent. How does that make you feel? Right. Even if you're clueless, you say, "Well, God, this guy really thinks I could help here." Okay. We need to find ways to enlist our parents in this process. And we also need to make sure that we are not adopting rules and procedures, particularly related to discipline, that are at odds with our educational goals. Discipline has to be connected to your education goals. And if you don't start by asking, why is this child acting out? What's behind the behavior problem? Because you're only focusing on the behavior, then what you also always will find is that the behavior will get worse. It'll never get addressed. In American schools, at least, I'm not sure about Sweden or India, we use two strategies to punish kids, typically. We start with humiliation, and we work our way to exclusion. And neither strategy is effective at changing behavior. The goal of discipline should be to produce kids who become self-disciplined. Right? If you find you're punishing the same kids over and over again, what does that suggest? It's not working. Okay, it's not working. And if your discipline strategy doesn't include a plan to get that kid reconnected to learning, so they actually care about their own education, care about being there, then over time what you can find is that you have no ability at all to discipline that child. Because a child who doesn't care about learning is a child you can't even discipline. You tell them, "I'm going to fail you." What do they say? "Fail me." "I'm going to send you home." "Send me home, please." I was in Cleveland, and they were about to give a boy 3-day suspension for truancy. He said, "Give me 5 days. I want 5 days." And they said, "Okay, we'll do it." And he was ready to do it. Why would the principal give him 5 days for truancy, knowing full well this would not stop the kid from not attending school? Why would he do it? Because he was really trying about weeding somebody out of the school, getting rid of a kid who was a problem, not about changing, getting at the root, why is this kid not coming to school? Okay, so we have to ask ourselves, what are we doing when we're disciplining kids? Is it connected to our educational goals? Is it focused on developing character in children? It takes more work to do it that way, I'll admit, but it's far more effective. Give you a few examples of schools that I know well that are adopted rituals and practice that reinforce their core values. Holland Elementary School in Virginia Beach, every morning when the children arrive, there's a line of adults at the front door to welcome them and greet them. "Good morning, hi, good to see you." So those kids are there. So they start the day with adults happy to see them every day. The PS 138, I was there. This is a school in the South Bronx, the Morrisania section. This is, if you saw that series, The Bronx is Burning, this is the Bronx that burned in the 70s. Totally looked like a war zone. Now it just looks like a lot of abandoned lots. I was given a tour of the school recently by a 4th grader. She's showing me around the school. She's very proud of the school because it's a high-performing, high-poverty school. We get to the 2nd floor. She said, "This is the special place in the school." I said, "Why is it special?" She said, "Because we have the only museum dedicated to the Bronx in our school." And we walk through the hall, and there's antiques on the walls. There are LPs from groups that came from the Bronx. There are pictures of Joe Louis when he fought in the Bronx. And what I'm struck by is all of it is within easy reach of children. They could easily touch it. They could break it. They could vandalize it. So I asked the girl, aren't they worried that kids will destroy this stuff? And she looks at me like I'm some kind of sicko. She says, so why would someone want to destroy it? We're really happy to have this here. I know where you're from. You know where I'm from? I'm from schools where they deny kids access to science equipment because they're afraid they'll break it. Right? So at a school like that in Oakland, science class, no science equipment, it's in the closet. I asked the teacher, when do they get to use it? She said, if they're good, I let them use it. Right? It's like those people who cover their furniture, waiting for special guests to come, then they take it off, right? If it's covered, you know you're not the special guest, right? Why is it that the kids at PS 138 can be trusted not to break things in their environment? It's all about the culture they've created. Okay? What about Excellence Charter School, which I mentioned already, where they call the kids scholars? They actually take breaks throughout the day and they say, act like animals. Act like animals. So the kids, some kids will be a gorilla, some kids will be a lion, and they're all through the hallway. Why? Because they want them to have time to be free and to make noise if they want to, and to say that can be built into the time of day. School shouldn't have to be about regimentation, about a fixation on control. Because we got all these kids with all this energy they want to get out, and they want to be able to, they say build it in. It says build it in. Animal time. And they say, okay, animal time is over now, okay? Back to work. But they got that out, okay? IS 228. They reward kids with a currency in school. They get school bucks. Okay? So if you have good behavior, good attendance, good performance, you get currency. At a store that's run by kids, you can redeem your bucks for kickballs, for pens, pencils, because they want to give incentives for good behavior in the school. And there's another high-performing, high-poverty school in the South Bronx. They also think that poor kids need music and art, and they shouldn't be given a curriculum that narrowly focuses on test preparation. Because if the kids feel good about being in school, they'll actually do better academically. City on a Hill in Boston, a charter school, every Friday there's a town hall meeting run by the kids. Run by the kids, because they want the kids to practice democracy. And they do it because they want the kids to have a role in leading their school, because they believe that cultivating leadership in kids means giving them the opportunity to lead with support from adults. School of the Future, my daughter attends, does what this school does with the exhibitions. My daughter last year spent her whole year working on a comparative research paper of the Inca and the Roman Empire. Had to have multiple citations. Had to not only present this 25-page paper at the end, but had to also present it before a group of judges. Because they believe that the state standards are not high enough. They want to go higher than the state standards. They want to make sure the kids can actually read well, write well, speak well. Landmark High School, a staff meeting, a faculty meeting every morning for 15 minutes, every morning. One of my former students teaches there, I said, is this a good thing? He said, it's the best part of the day. I said, why? He said, it reminds me I'm part of a team. And together we talk about what's going on in school that day, we check in with each other, and we go out there and say, ready for the day, because we're together. Cultures are rooted in deliberate practices. Think about what are the practices you need to create that reinforce the core values of your school, that send the message to the kids, we care about you, we value you, what we're doing here is important. Roland Tharp, my friend, says we should not practice what he calls the cemetery method of teaching. You know the cemetery method? Line them up in rows, keep them as still as possible. Right? And I don't like to be the cemetery presenter either, right? So let me pause, just because I've covered a lot here, and I want just to hear your thoughts and reactions to what I've been saying.
When my mother shifted me to South Central LA and I was in Latino culture, to identify with the teacher was a mistake. You break faith with the group, so you had to identify with the shame culture of the group. And there are two distinct cultural systems, so to navigate through that as a kid was to sort of figure out it's just not culture, it's different dynamics of culture.
That's very important. And that's one of the reasons I started this by saying we've got to understand more about the cultural norms of the children we're working with. So, for example, many of us, I mean, most schools have a rule, you're not allowed to hit people, right? But many kids come from an environment where what's the matter? If someone hits you, what do? You hit them back.
Yeah.
So we already have a setup where some kids have been given very explicit instruction at home about what to do when they're attacked or when they're assaulted that's in conflict with what we do in school.
But you know, even the culture of violence, in the Irish, it's great to have a Donnybrook and slug it out. But in South Central LA, they carry knives and they kill you.
That's
I
right.
couldn't go into the playground in the ninth
That's
grade.
right. That's right.
And as an intellectual, I was marked.
different.
I left the school, and I was safe in LA High,
Right.
which was a big mixed cultural public school.
Right. So I would add, it's good. We need to learn about the cultural norms that are out there in the community. At the same time, we can say, okay, I understand that at home you hit when you were hit, when someone hits you. Here we're going to do it differently. Okay? And I respect the fact that that might be the way you do it out there, but here we've got to do it differently. We've got to talk it through. We've got to, but at least acknowledging that there's a difference is an important part of teaching them there's another way to do it.
I used to teach at a school in East Harlem that was just closed this year for poor performance. And the reason why I left was not the performance of the children, but the performance of the adults. There were so many teachers there who were not willing to put in this time and to put in the effort to create this culture. And what it did was it completely diseased the entire school. So we're closed down and we blame the performance of the kids, but how do you propose we change cultures of schools like this? Because I know that's not the only one. And we can't shut down every school in the city that's like this.
No.
What do?
You got to start with that staff. And it's got to start with around a common shared vision of what we're trying to do here, what we're trying to accomplish. You get that with Ross. But now the key is to make it your own. Right? It's coming from the Ross Institute to you. How are you going to interpret that now? Because guess what? It might look different in New York City than it does in East Hampton. Okay? A little bit. Okay? Or in Sweden. Okay? So you have to now say, okay, we've got these concepts, we've got these ideas. How do we adapt it to our circumstances? How do we make it work for us with our children? And that's going to be an ongoing process. But it starts with a common vision. And then from there, you need a common set of strategies. This is how we're going to do it. If this is what we agree we're trying to do, this is how we're going to do it. And you have to keep coming back to it and ask, are we actually fulfilling this vision that we laid out there?
So how do you reach those teachers that'll yes you to death and they turn around and go, I'm not doing that.
That's the leadership challenge, but it's not just the leadership challenge, it's also a challenge to the colleagues. Right? Because if it's only up to the leader to hold them accountable for their behavior, that's a lot of work on the leader. If their own colleagues are saying, you know what, this is the way I think we need to do it, this is what we agreed to, and I think you need to too, it starts to send a message that's, think about it, the last slide I didn't have up there is about how cultures change. If you've been watching, anybody watch Mad Men? This series on, I don't even know what channel it's on. I haven't even watched it. I only watched a little bit of it. But what's so interesting about it is it gives you a slice of American life in, the late 50s, early 60s, and you're so struck by how different things are, right? People smoked all the time, and, but what it reminds you of is that cultures change. Culture's not static, okay? And even in a school, you can create and mold a culture that enables you to go beyond the kind of dysfunction and unhealthy behaviors to adopt a climate that actually feels better to work in. It feels so much better to be in a school where people are supportive of each other. You want to work harder. You don't mind staying late because you feel like you're a part of something, you're doing something so important. It's affirming to you and to your spirit. But there are some schools, you see people, the teachers are running out faster than the kids at the end of the day because it's such a sick environment. So this culture work is really essential. And I encourage you at some point during the year, bring in an outsider. And ask that outsider to just walk through the halls and give you some feedback, listen in on the lunchroom conversation, not just amongst the kids, but amongst the teachers. Right? Watch the kids in the non-formal settings, recess, break time. How do the kids carry themselves? How do they treat each other? If they have to be watched constantly, if there's a lot of yelling, screaming and policing of kids, you know that they haven't really taken the time to create a culture where the kids actually know what's expected of them. So you need that feedback to know whether or not you're getting there. And not to beat up on yourselves, but to know that's what we need to work towards.
Good morning. I'm Tim Oza. I'm the assistant principal of RGA Middle School.
Good morning.
And I wanted to hear you speak a little bit more to how do teachers who are not members of the dominant culture in their classrooms become more familiar with those cultures, and how maybe some practical strategies around, like you were talking about code switching, so how you create and maintain culturally affirming processes in the classroom.
Right. Well, as a whole other presentation I do as a teacher's anthropologist, where the teacher really has to spend time studying the culture. Bill was describing that a little bit with his experiences of teaching in different settings with different norms. You actually have to take the time to that's why I started with this, learn about who you're teaching. Learn about what's going on with them. Listen, be a good listener, right? And the essential ingredient here is the humility, to recognize that you need to learn. You need to learn what's going to take to teach these kids. You might be well-skilled. You might have gone to a great grad school, have good education, but do you know what it's going to take to teach those children? And that's not simply about how you've been trained. It's also about your ability to learn from them, to build these relationships with them so that you can, in turn, figure out how to guide them and provide them with instruction. So it starts with, I think, an attitude of humility, starts with a willingness to listen, to learn to the children, to their parents, to your colleagues who might know more, a willingness to read, a willingness to even go out into the communities where the kids live and also learn from those experiences, and to see this as an ongoing process, not something that, okay, I got it figured out, I don't need to learn anymore. No, we have to see it as something we continue to do. And we shouldn't assume that even if you have a similar racial background, right, to the children that you know, right? I think you're from Oakland, right? No, I'm from Brooklyn. You're from Brooklyn? Okay, well, you have an advantage. You're from Brooklyn. So I thought somebody was from Oakland that was coming in. You were in Oakland. Okay, well, when I lived in the Bay Area for a long time, and one of the things I was struck by was how different the culture of California was from New York. And you can't assume that just because you have a similar racial, ethnic background that you know how to communicate, how to understand how they see things. So I would spend the time doing that as an educator, really trying to learn, trying to understand, and if you can just listen to the kids can tell you so much, you know. And it's your ability to incorporate that into your teaching that's going to help you in figuring out how to better serve their needs. So that's a short answer for a complex question.
By listening to some people, even Bill, saying Latino, what is it to be Latino? Because within Latin American countries, there are Asian people, there are people of Syrian Lebanese descent. Peru had an Asian president, and Argentina had a Syrian Lebanese president with a mostly Jewish staff. There are whites, there are Germans, there are people speaking French, Dutch. So what is it to be Latino? So I have to break down that stereotyping that most people I find in this country have of Latin Americans. And it's sometimes, as you said before, it brings up strain because people have this ingrained stereotypical view of Latinos that it's really hard to make them understand that I speak Spanish, I am white. And then there are other people that speak Spanish and are of Asian descent, or they're black, or they're mixed, or they're mulatto. So, I don't know, how would you approach that so that it's not strainful?
We use these terms as shorthand, Latino, black, white, and there's so much diversity within these categories. Right? Americans especially are troubled by people we can't categorize easily, right? You know, I had a friend from Fiji, and he was a graduate student at Berkeley, and I said, how do you like America so far? He says, well, you know, I'm struck by the fact that every time I meet someone, they want to know, what am I? That's one of the first questions that comes up. I said, why does that bother you? He says, because I know they want to put me in a box. And I'm not easily put in a box, because they don't even know where Fiji is, right? And that desire to put people in boxes so we can say, okay, you're Latino, I know exactly how to deal with you now. Because we use these boxes as shorthand for figuring out, okay, how do I engage? How do I interact? And that's the tendency, when I talked about the danger of stereotypes, that all of us have to be mindful of to avoid. Because we've got individual differences, we've got so many layers to who we are that we should never allow these broad generalizations to serve as some information we think we know now about a person. So I agree entirely, and that's true for lots of different groups.
One of the difficulties that I found teaching in an alternative school in high school was just getting the parents there to the school to establish those relationships. And that's, I wanted you to sort of speak to that.
So I don't want to keep layering new responsibilities on you, but I will anyway. You need a plan for engaging parents. A plan that starts with day one, how we're going to engage them. Because if you start with day one, then you have activities and throughout the year, it's going to make it easier because the parents start to get it. Oh, this school requires me to do various kinds of things, and it's built into the culture of how we do things here. The first point of contact with a parent should not be a call about the problem with the kid, okay? And if we could start by having some way in which we get to meet them, get to know them, so they understand who we are, what we expect, we learn about who they are, what they expect, because what we want is a real partnership where it's clear we want the same thing, right? You want to see your child succeed, I want to see your child succeed. How do we work together to make that happen? I'd also encourage you not to be fixated only on getting them to come to the school. Getting them to come to school is important, and it always helps if kids are performing, presenting, and you got food, that usually will get a lot of parents out, okay? Because parents like to see their kids presenting. But there are lots of parents who are working so hard that their ability to come to school should not be held against them, okay? The most important parental involvement is what they do at home. If they get their kids to school on time, to bed on time, turn off the TV, give them a place to work, you have a partner, even if it's a partner you don't see. Don't be, the tendency to judge parents that we don't see, say, oh, they don't care about their kids. They didn't show up at 3 o'clock. They didn't take off work today to see me. Well, come on. You know, we need a higher degree of empathy here and to recognize that not all parents can do it that way, and there's got to be a variety of ways. But if you build a variety of activities into the school year, you'll get more parents coming than we often see in many schools. Because many of these schools, even though they're serving parents that are, you know, impoverished, are getting a lot of involvement from their parents. So it can happen.
I think of all the teachers that are here today, the Swedes have in some ways the most challenging task in terms of what you've been talking about. And I'm very curious in terms of what your challenges are and how does this resonate with you, because you've got how many different languages, different cultures? 60? 60 languages.
It's almost like New York City.
But
no, I know it's different because
but
you're war
it's-
refugees.
But it's Sweden.
That's right.
So and also many of the parents, depending on where the countries that they're coming from, many of the parents have never been in school, any kind of school. And many of the kids didn't come to school until they came to Sweden.
Right.
So there are multiple challenges to be able to get the parents involved, including the profoundly different language barriers. Because if you got 60 languages, what are you going to do? Get 60 interpreters?
No, it's a huge challenge. And I only had one very brief visit to your school. So, but what I was struck by, because I talked to the students while I was there, okay, is many of them feel they will never become Swedish. Okay? That is, no matter how lovely the school is and how great the environment you've created, they feel they're faced with a fundamental problem. Sweden doesn't want them. Right? And that is an issue I'd encourage you to talk to them about, right? To talk to them, how are they perceiving? What are they perceiving? Because, I'd say this across the board, if we have the courage to talk to the kids, we'll learn so much about what's happening in their lives, about the challenges they're facing, and about what we might do to better serve them. So I understand how difficult it is to work in the kind of school you're in, because you've got children who are, some of them have been traumatized by war, right? And they're bringing that with them to school. And some of them don't even live with their parents. They're living with relatives or siblings they've been raised by. So there's numerous challenges these kids are facing. If you can create an environment where they feel confident in you, that they can talk about it, then you can build those relationships. And you can help them figure out, okay, well, yeah, life is hard. Let's figure out how to make it less hard. Let's figure out how we're going to navigate it. And because there's no simple solution to this. But I do believe, and part of the reason why I stay in this field is education is the source of so many answers. That is, that by problem solving together and by working with our children, we can begin to find some strategies that make it possible to navigate that world more successfully. So I don't want to pretend it's easy, but I do encourage you to create the space where you can hear them and talk to them and learn about their experiences. So I don't know if any of you want to say anything. I know this is such a American-focused kind of discussion I presented today. Do you see a resonance to what your experience in Sweden?
In spite of all these things that they say in the school, they feel quite safe in the school because so many of them are so worried when they're leaving. They have to quit school because they know that we're really taking care of them. And they really feel, I think, that quite a few of the teachers really care about them. So they're really worried. I get these big hugs from the worst kids that have been awful, horrible, have been yelling through the years. And they come back and they give me big hugs, and you were a great teacher because you cared about it, because you were yelling and yelling and yelling. So it's a sort of a safe place for them.
Yeah. And that says a lot about the school, that you've been able to create that kind of a safe environment. And I say the next step is for that environment to then help them in figuring out the next steps. How to go out there and deal with the biases they're going to encounter, the discrimination, to try to be as successful as they can be in life. And so, because as I started with, schools should prepare us for the world we're going to enter as adults. You know, that's when we know we're succeeding, and that's an ongoing reflection to figure out, okay, what is it going to take to really prepare them for a world that's unjust and unequal and in so many ways unfair. Thank you. Thanks, Al.